Dry Creek, Texas Territory. August 1878. The sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, beating down on the dusty main street like God's own furnace. The temperature had reached 112 degrees by noon, and still it climbed, turning the wooden boardwalks into griddles, and the metal bars of the cage into instruments of torture. In the center of the town square, beneath the skeletal shade of a dying oak tree, stood an iron cage no bigger than a horse stall. Inside, curled against the far corner like a wounded animal, sat Catalina Rodriguez. Her once beautiful black hair hung in matted tangles around her sunburned face, and her simple brown dress had faded to the color of dust and despair. The metal shackles around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw, leaving angry red welts that spoke of days spent in this hellish prison.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
A hand-painted wooden sign hung from the cage like a scarlet letter. Vagrant, nitrogen monoxide family, nitrogen monoxide money, nitrogen monoxide home. Below it, in smaller letters that twisted the knife deeper, let this be a warning to all undesirables. The townspeople of Dry Creek moved past her cage with practiced indifference, their boots stirring up clouds of dust that settled on everything like a shroud. Some averted their eyes entirely, as if poverty might be contagious. Others stared with the morbid fascination of spectators at a hanging, whispering among themselves about the Mexican woman who had dared to sleep behind their respectable businesses. From the shade of Murphy's General Store, Sheriff Buck Dalton leaned against a wooden post, chewing tobacco and watching Catalina with cold satisfaction. A thick-set man with graying whiskers and eyes like chips of flint, he wore his authority like a badge of honor and his cruelty like a comfortable coat. When a wagon appeared at the far end of Main Street, moving slowly through the heat shimmer, he straightened up and spit a brown stream into the dirt. The wagon was unlike any the good people of Dry Creek were accustomed to seeing. It was sturdy and well-maintained, pulled by two strong horses whose coats gleamed with care despite the brutal heat. But it was the man driving that made conversations die and heads turn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his long black hair bound with leather and adorned with a single eagle feather. His skin was bronzed by countless seasons under the Texas sun, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they swept across the town square. Gray Wolf had been born with a different name in a different time, when the Comanche rode free across the endless grasslands and the white man's towns were nothing but distant nightmares. But those days were gone, buried beneath the weight of broken treaties and endless war. Now he lived between worlds, accepted by neither, carrying the grief of his people and the loss of his family like stones in his chest. Sheriff Dalton pushed himself away from the post and walked into the street, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. The message was clear, even if the gesture was subtle. Strangers weren't welcome in Dry Creek, especially ones who looked like they belonged on the wrong side of a cavalry charge. "You're new here, I reckon," Dalton called out, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "That there's just some Mexican trash we caught stealing food behind the bakery 3 days ago." Sheriff locked her up before she could spread disease or start begging from decent folk. Gray Wolf, who had taken the English name Matthew Wolf, when dealing with white settlements, brought his wagon to a stop near the cage. He said nothing. At first, just studied the scene with the careful attention of a hunter reading tracks. His eyes moved from the sign to the woman inside, taking note of her condition, her obvious dehydration, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. "Why is she in that cage?" he asked finally, his English accented but clear. Years of trading with white settlements had given him fluency in their language, though he spoke it like a man handling a knife carefully and with full awareness of its cutting edge. Dalton laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against wood. "Because she's poor," he said with a shrug that suggested the explanation was obvious. No husband, no kin, no property, and no business being in a respectable town. We don't tolerate drifters here, especially ones who steal. Gray Wolf stepped down from his wagon with fluid grace, his moccasins silent on the dusty ground. He was taller than most of the white men in town, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of natural authority. When he walked closer to the cage, several townspeople stepped back instinctively, though they couldn't have said why. Inside the cage, Catalina raised her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting his through the iron bars. She had stopped hoping for rescue days ago, stopped believing that anyone would see her as more than a problem to be solved or a lesson to be taught. But something in this stranger's gaze was different. He looked at her not as a criminal or a burden, but as a human being. She is not livestock, Gray Wolf said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the square. Dalton's face darkened. She's not my problem either, he snapped. And she sure as hell ain't yours, Indian. I suggest you move along before you find yourself sharing that cage. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Several men had emerged from nearby buildings, their hands moving to their weapons with practiced ease. The message was clear. Gray Wolf was outnumbered and unwelcome, and his concern for the caged woman was seen as an act of defiance rather than compassion. But Gray Wolf had faced worse odds than this. He had ridden with war chiefs who could count coup on a dozen enemies in a single battle. He had survived the destruction of his entire way of life and the murder of his family. A handful of frightened shopkeepers and one corrupt sheriff held no terror for him as he stood before the cage. Memories flooded back unbidden. His wife, Morning Star, who had died giving birth to their second child during the harsh winter when the cavalry had driven their band ever further from their traditional hunting grounds. His son, Little Hawk, barely 5 years old, who had perished from the white man's diseases along with dozens of other children. His infant daughter, never even given a name, who had followed her mother into the spirit world before she could take her first breath. He had buried them on a hillside overlooking the Brazos River, in graves marked only by stones arranged in the traditional way. Then he had ridden away from what remained of his people, unable to bear the sight of other families that reminded him of what he had lost. For 3 years, he had wandered between the white and Comanche worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying his grief like a physical weight now. Looking at this woman trapped in her cage of iron and indifference, he saw something of his own isolation reflected back at him. She too was caught between worlds, too Mexican for the white townspeople to accept, too poor for anyone to care about, too proud to beg even as she slowly died of thirst and heat. Gray Wolf walked back to his wagon and returned with a water skin and a piece of cornbread wrapped in clean cloth. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as he approached the cage again, kneeling down to pass the food and water through the bars. Here, he said softly in Spanish, recognizing her heritage. This will help. Catalina stared at the offering for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Then her trembling fingers closed around the water skin, and she drank deeply, the liquid running down her chin and staining the front of her torn dress. When she had drunk her fill, she accepted the bread, eating it slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned not to waste a single crumb. Sheriff Dalton had had enough. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, striding forward with his hand now openly gripping his pistol. "That's destruction of public property. You're interfering with lawful punishment." Gray Wolf stood slowly, turning to face the sheriff. With calm deliberation. "Your law," he said, "is not justice. My law is the only law that matters in this town," Dalton snarled. "And it says that woman stays in that cage until she learns her place. And what place would that be?" "Gray?" Wolf asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The place where a woman dies for the crime of being poor? The place where human beings are caged like animals for your entertainment?" The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the confrontation like moths to a flame.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Women peered out from behind curtains. Children pressed their faces against storefront windows, and men emerged from saloons and shops to witness the standoff. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gray Wolf reached into his wagon and withdrew a tool that made several townspeople gasp in recognition and fear. It was a war club, beautifully crafted from oak and decorated with brass studs and leather wrapping. But he wasn't planning to use it as a weapon. Instead, he hefted it like a hammer and approached the cage. "You touch that lock and you'll be a dead man," Dalton warned, drawing his pistol fully now. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Gray Wolf paused, looking back at the sheriff with eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by one more threat. "Then you will have to shoot. A man for showing mercy," he said simply. "Is that the story you want your children to tell about their father?" The question hit its mark. Dalton was a man who prided himself on his reputation, who wanted to be remembered as a keeper of the peace rather than a cold-blooded killer. But he also couldn't afford to back down in front of the entire town. Couldn't let an Indian, even one who spoke English and wore white man's clothes, defy his authority. "So publicly, I'm warning you," Dalton said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his bluster. Gray Wolf turned back to the cage and raised the war club. The first blow rang out like a bell, sending sparks flying from the lock mechanism. The second blow loosened it visibly. The third sent pieces of metal scattering across the dusty ground. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the crowd. A shopkeeper froze with a broom in her hands, forgotten. A young boy dropped the newspaper he had been carrying, the pages scattering in the hot wind. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the banker's wife, clutched her pearls and made a small sound of distress. The cage door swung open with a rusty creak that seemed to echo across the entire town square. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Gray Wolf stepped inside the small space, his imposing frame filling the cramped confines as he knelt beside Catalina. "Can you stand?" he asked gently in Spanish. Catalina tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. She shook her head slightly, the movement causing her to wince as the shackles bit into her raw wrists. "Then I will carry you," Gray Wolf said, and there was something in his voice that made the wall she had built around her heart begin to crack. He lifted her as carefully as he would handle a wounded bird, his strong arms cradling her against his chest while the blanket he had brought shielded her from the stares of the crowd. She was lighter than she should have been, her body weakened by days without proper food or water, but there was still strength in her, core of unbreakable will that had kept her alive through the worst of it. Gray Wolf carried Catalina across the town square, past Sheriff Dalton who stood frozen with indecision, past the gawking townspeople who whispered among themselves like a Greek chorus commenting on a tragedy. His wagon waited in the dust and heat, a refuge from the hostility that surrounded them on all sides, as he gently placed her in the wagon bed. Arranging blankets to cushion her journey, Catalina looked back at the cage that had been her prison. 3 days and nights she had endured its confines, 3 days of burning sun and freezing desert nights, 3 days of shame and abandonment. Now it stood empty, its door hanging open like a mouth frozen in surprise. "Where are you taking her?" Mrs. Whitmore called out, her voice shrill with indignation. "She's a criminal, a vagrant." Gray Wolf climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. When he looked back at the crowd, his expression was grave but not angry. "I am taking her home," he said simply. "She doesn't have a home." Dalton shouted, finally finding his voice again. "That's why she was in the cage." Gray Wolf's eyes found the sheriff's across the dusty expanse of the square. "Now she does," he said, and there was a finality in his voice that brooked no argument. The wagon began to move, its wheels turning slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as Grey Wolf guided his horses toward the edge of town. Behind them, the crowd buzzed with excitement and outrage, voices rising and falling like the sound of angry bees. But ahead lay the open road, stretching toward the horizon like a promise. Catalina lay in the wagon bed, feeling the sun on her face and the steady rhythm of the wheels beneath her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. She didn't know where this strange man was taking her, didn't know what he wanted from her, didn't even know his name. But she knew with absolute certainty that whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. As the town of Dry Creek faded into the heat shimmer behind them, Grey Wolf began to sing softly in Comanche, an old traveling song his grandfather had taught him. The melody was mournful but hopeful, speaking of journeys that led to new beginnings and losses that eventually transformed into unexpected gifts. Catalina didn't understand the words, but she understood the emotion behind them, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her story wasn't over after all. The road stretched ahead of them, dusty and uncertain, but filled with possibility. Behind them, the empty cage stood as a monument to cruelty, but also as proof that even the strongest bars could be broken by someone with enough courage to swing the hammer. And in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled of sage and hope, Catalina Rodriguez began the long journey back to being human again. The wagon rolled steadily away from Dry Creek, its wheels carving twin tracks through the dust as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Grey Wolf guided his horses with practiced ease, following a barely visible trail that wound through scrub brush and rocky outcroppings toward the distant hills. The landscape here was harsh but beautiful, painted in shades of gold and amber that seemed to glow in the fading light. In the wagon bed, Catalina drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally beginning to relax after days of tension and fear. The steady motion of the wagon was hypnotic, and the blankets Grey Wolf had wrapped around her held the comforting sense of cedar smoke and wild sage. For the first time since her husband's death 6 months ago, she felt something approaching safety. Grey Wolf glanced back occasionally to check on his passenger, noting the way her breathing had grown deeper and more regular as they put distance between themselves and the town. He had seen that look before, the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits, who had survived on nothing but stubborn will and the faint hope that tomorrow might be different from today, the memory of his own. Desperate times came flooding back. After Morningstar's death, he had wandered for weeks without purpose, eating little, sleeping rough, carrying his grief like a physical weight that threatened to crush him. It had been an old medicine man named Wise Owl who had found him collapsed beside a stream, more dead than alive, and nursed him back to health with patient kindness. The heart that has been broken, Wise Owl had told him, becomes stronger when it heals, like a bone that knits back together. But first, it must be allowed to rest. Now, watching Catalina sleep fitfully in the wagon bed, Grey Wolf understood that he was being given the chance to pass that kindness forward, to offer shelter to someone who needed it as desperately as he once had. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Grey Wolf guided the wagon off the main trail toward a small grove of cottonwood trees. A creek ran nearby, its water clear and cold despite the summer heat, and the trees provided blessed shade after the punishing exposure of the open road. He brought the wagon to a gentle stop and climbed down, moving quietly so as not to wake Catalina. But the change in motion had already stirred her, and she opened her eyes to find herself surrounded by green leaves and the sound of running water instead of iron bars and hostile stares. "Where are we?" she asked in Spanish, her voice still, hoarse but stronger than it had been in the town square. "Safe," Grey Wolf replied in the same language, his accent marking him as someone who had learned it through trade rather than birth. "We will rest here tonight." Catalina struggled to sit up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested the movement. The shackles were gone. Grey Wolf had removed them during the journey while she slept, and the relief of having her hands free was almost overwhelming. She flexed her fingers experimentally, marveling at the simple pleasure of unrestricted movement. Grey Wolf was already setting up camp with efficient movements born of long practice. He unhitched the horses and led them to the creek to drink, then hobbled them so they could graze on the sweet grass that grew along the water's edge. From the wagon, he produced a small iron pot, dried meat, coffee, and other supplies. "You know my name," Catalina said suddenly, watching him work. "You spoke it in the town." Grey Wolf paused in his preparations, realizing that in all the chaos of the rescue, formal introductions had been forgotten. "I heard the sheriff use it," he admitted. "But you do not know mine." "No," she said, simply, pulling the blanket more tightly around her shoulders despite the lingering heat of the day. "I am called Grey Wolf among my people," he said, adding wood to the small fire he had built. "But the white men know me as Matthew Wolf. You may call me whichever feels right to you." Catalina studied his face in the flickering firelight, noting the strong cheekbones and the proud bearing that spoke of noble ancestry. But there was also sadness there, a deep weariness that matched her own. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The question that had been burning in her mind since he first approached the cage. Grey Wolf was quiet for a long moment, stirring the contents of the pot as steam began to rise from its surface. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "Because no one should die in a cage," he said simply. "And because I know what it is to be alone in a world that has no place for you." As they shared this simple meal, Grey Wolf had prepared a stew of dried meat and wild onions that tasted like ambrosia to Catalina's starved palate. The conversation gradually turned to their respective histories. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cottonwood trees and creating an intimate circle of warmth in the vast Texas darkness. Catalina spoke first, haltingly, about the life she had lost. Her husband, Miguel, had been a skilled carpenter who dreamed of building a house for them in California, away from the prejudice and limited opportunities they faced in Texas. They had saved every penny for 3 years, living in a tiny room behind the blacksmith's shop and planning their future with the careful attention other people devoted to prayer. Then the fever had come, sweeping through the Mexican quarter of San Antonio like wildfire. Miguel had sickened and died within a week, leaving Catalina with nothing but a handful of coins and a wagon load of debt. The landlord had thrown her out when she couldn't pay the rent, and her few relatives had been either unable or unwilling to help a childless widow with no prospects. "I walked for 6 weeks, she said, staring into the fire as if she could see those desperate days reflected in the flames. "Sleeping wherever I could find shelter, eating whatever I could beg or find. I had heard there might be work in the northern towns, cleaning houses or taking in washing. But when I reached Dry Creek, I was too weak to keep walking." She had made the mistake of sleeping behind the bakery, drawn by the warmth that radiated from the ovens and the sweet smell of fresh bread. The baker had found her there in the morning and immediately summoned the sheriff, claiming she was a thief even though she had taken nothing. I tried to explain. Catalina continued, her voice growing bitter with the memory. "I told them I was just resting, that I would move on as soon as I was strong enough. But they said I was a vagrant, a danger to their community. The cage was supposed to be a lesson to me and to anyone else who might think about bringing their poverty to Dry Creek." Grey Wolf listened without interruption, recognizing the particular cruelty of people who had turned their backs on suffering, because acknowledging it might require them to act. When Catalina finished her story, he was quiet for several minutes, organizing his own memories into words that might make sense to someone who had never lived between two worlds. "My wife was called Morning Star," he said finally, his voice soft with old grief. "She died 3 winters ago, along with our children. After that, I could not stay with my people. Their happiness was like a knife in my chest, and my sorrow was like a shadow that fell across their celebrations. He told her about the long wandering that had followed, the gradual realization that he could never go back to the life he had known. The Comanche way was dying, crushed beneath the weight of an expanding nation that had no room for those who lived differently. But the white world offered no true welcome. Either he was tolerated as long as he was useful, feared when he was not. I learned to live in the spaces between, he said, feeding another piece of wood to the fire. Trading with ranchers who needed horses, guiding travelers who were lost, sometimes working cattle drives when they were desperate enough to hire a Comanche. It is not the life I was born for, but it is the life I have made. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, Catalina found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her since the rescue. "Where are you taking me?" She sighed quietly. "You told the people in town that you were taking me home, but I have no home." Gray Wolf poked at the coals with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. "I have a place," he said after a moment. "A small ranch about 2 days' ride from here. It is not much a cabin, a barn, some horses and cattle. But it is mine, bought with money earned trading and working for white ranchers who needed my skills." He looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You could stay there if you wish. There's work to be done cooking, mending, tending the garden. I am not asking for anything from you except company. I have been alone too long, and perhaps you have as well." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Catalina felt tears prick at her eyes. After months of rejection and cruelty, the simple kindness of it was almost overwhelming. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "You don't know me. I could be a thief or worse." Gray Wolf smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his stern features completely. "If you were a thief," he said gently, "you would not have been dying of thirst in that cage. A thief would have found a way to get water." The logic was irrefutable, and despite everything she had endured, Catalina found herself smiling in return. It felt strange, using muscles that had been dormant for so long, but also right somehow. "Don't have anything to offer in return," she said honestly. "No money, no possessions, nothing but these clothes on my back." "I did not ask for payment," Gray Wolf replied. "I asked for company." "There is a difference." As they prepared to sleep, Gray Wolf wrapping himself in a blanket beside the fire, Catalina making a bed in the wagon with the cushions he provided. A sound in the distance made them both freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of horses moving through the night, their hoofbeats muffled but rhythmic. Gray Wolf was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that never left his side. In the moonlight, his face had hardened into the expression of a warrior, all traces of gentleness erased by the potential for danger. "What is it?" Catalina whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. "Riders." Gray Wolf replied quietly, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. 3, maybe 4 horses, moving slowly, like they are tracking something. The implication was clear without being spoken. Sheriff Dalton had not been content to let them simply leave. Whether motivated by wounded pride, a genuine belief in his authority, or simple vindictiveness, he had organized a pursuit. Gray Wolf quickly doused the fire, plunging their camp into darkness. The sudden absence of light was disorienting, but as their eyes adjusted, the moonlight provided enough illumination to see the immediate area around the creek. "Can you ride?" he asked Catalina urgently. She nodded, though the prospect of bouncing on horseback in her weakened condition was daunting. But anything was better than being dragged back to that cage, and she could hear the determination in Gray Wolf's voice, moving with practiced silence. Gray Wolf saddled 2 of his horses while leaving the wagon and remaining supplies behind. It was a painful loss. The wagon contained everything he owned, except for his weapons and the clothes on his back, but survival took precedence over possessions. As they prepared to mount up, the sound of the pursuing riders grew closer. Voices carried on the night air, harsh and angry, speaking of justice and consequences. But there was something else in those voices too, a quality that suggested this pursuit was about more than just enforcing the law. This way, Gray Wolf whispered, leading Catalina and the horses away from the creek toward a rocky outcropping that would hide their movement. We will follow the stream bed north. The water will hide our tracks. The next several hours passed in a blur of careful movement through treacherous terrain. Gray Wolf led the way, his knowledge of the land allowing him to find paths that would have been invisible to their pursuers. They rode through shallow streams that would wash away their horses' hoofprints, across rock formations that would leave no trace of their passage, and through dense thickets that would discourage anyone who tried to follow. Catalina clung to her horse's mane, her body aching from the unaccustomed exercise, but her spirit buoyed by the steady competence of her rescuer. This man who had appeared from nowhere to break her chains was proving to be as skilled at evading pursuit as he had been at confronting injustice. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of pink and gold, Gray Wolf finally called a halt in a hidden canyon where a spring provided fresh water and overhanging rocks offered shelter from both sun and searching eyes. "We will rest here until tonight," he said, helping Catalina down from her horse. "They will not find this place, and by dark we will be close enough to my land to make a final run." Catalina sank gratefully onto a flat rock, her legs trembling with exhaustion. But despite her physical discomfort, she felt more alive than she had in months. For the first time since Miguel's death, she was moving towards something instead of simply running away. "Gray Wolf," she said as he tended to the horses. "What you did back there, leaving your wagon and supplies to help me escape, you lost everything because of me." He paused in his work, considering her words carefully. "I lost things," he said finally, "but things can be replaced. What I gained cannot be bought with money. What did you gain?" she asked, genuinely curious. Gray Wolf looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious but warm. "Purpose," he said simply. "For 3 years, I have been drifting like a ghost between worlds. Now I have something to protect, someone to care for. That is worth more than a wagon full of possessions." As they settled in to wait out the day, hidden in their rocky sanctuary while their pursuers searched the empty landscape below, Catalina felt something she had thought was lost forever beginning to stir in her chest. It was hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, but real as the sunrise that painted the canyon walls in shades of gold, and promise she had been rescued from a cage of iron and hatred. But more than that, she had been given the chance to become herself again. Whatever lay ahead at Gray Wolf's ranch, whatever challenges they might face together, it had to be better than the slow death she had been dying in that Texas town square. The sound of their pursuers grew fainter and finally disappeared altogether as the search moved away from their hiding place. In the growing heat of the day, wrapped in blankets that smelled of sage and safety, Catalina Rodriguez closed her eyes and dreamed of a future that might actually include tomorrow. The second night of their journey brought them to the edge of Gray Wolf's land, just as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. They had ridden hard through the afternoon, following deer trails and ancient Comanche paths that wound through landscapes untouched by wagon wheels or surveyors' chains. The pursuit had fallen far behind, lost in the maze of canyons and mesas that Gray Wolf navigated with the confidence of someone who had memorized every stone and shadow. As they crested a low ridge, Catalina gasped at the sight that greeted them. Spread out below was a hidden valley, perhaps 2 miles across and 3 miles long, enclosed by red rock walls that rose like the ramparts of a natural fortress. A stream meandered through the center, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows that created ribbons of green in the amber landscape. Horses grazed peacefully in the tall grass, their coats gleaming in the moonlight like living sculptures. "This is your ranch?" Catalina asked, wonder evident in her voice. After 2 days of harsh desert and rocky badlands, the valley seemed like a mirage of plenty. My home, Gray Wolf corrected gently, guiding his horse down a narrow trail that switchbacked along the valley wall. The white man's government says it belongs to me now, but the land belongs to itself. I am just its caretaker for a while. The descent took nearly an hour, following a path so cunningly concealed that Catalina understood how Gray Wolf had managed to keep this sanctuary hidden from the encroaching civilization that was transforming Texas. At the valley floor, they rode through grass that brushed their stirrups, past fruit trees heavy with late summer apples and pears, toward a cluster of buildings that materialized from the shadows, like something from a dream. The main house was larger than Catalina had expected, built of honey-colored stone with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. It was clearly the work of someone who understood both comfort and defense. The windows were positioned to provide clear views in all directions, and the walls were thick enough to stop bullets. But there were touches of beauty too, carved wooden shutters, flower boxes beneath the windows, and wind chimes that sang softly in the evening breeze. Behind the house stood a barn large enough for a dozen horses, several corrals, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything was well maintained and organized. Speaking of a man who took pride in his possessions while understanding their practical value, "It's beautiful," Catalina whispered, and meant it. After months of sleeping rough and living in fear, the sight of this peaceful sanctuary was almost overwhelming. Gray Wolf dismounted and helped her down from her horse, noting how she swayed slightly on her feet. The long ride had taken a toll on her already weakened body, but she had never complained, never asked him to slow down or stop. Her endurance impressed him, as did her quiet dignity in the face of hardship. As Gray Wolf led her toward the house, Catalina found herself hesitating at the bottom of the veranda steps. For months, she had been an unwelcome intruder wherever she went, sleeping in barns without permission, drinking from streams that belonged to others, existing on the margins of a world that had no place for her. The idea of walking through a front door, of being invited into someone's home as a guest rather than tolerated as a burden, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "What's wrong?" Gray Wolf asked, noticing her reluctance. "I'm not clean," Catalina said, suddenly aware of her bedraggled appearance. Her dress was torn and stained, her hair tangled with burrs and dust from their flight through the wilderness. She smelled of horses and fear and too many days without proper washing. "I don't want to soil your beautiful home." Gray Wolf's expression softened with understanding. "Wait here," he said simply, and disappeared around the side of the house. She heard the sound of a pump working, then his footsteps returning. He carried a basin of fresh water, clean towels, and a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. "The creek is cold at night," he explained, setting the basin on a wooden table on the veranda. "This will be warmer." He turned his back while she washed, giving her privacy while remaining close enough to ensure her safety. The simple act of cleaning her face and hands with warm water and sweet-smelling soap was a luxury she had almost forgotten existed. When she had finished, she felt more human than she had in weeks. Gray Wolf had changed clothes while she washed, trading his trail-worn buckskins for clean cotton trousers and a white shirt that made his dark skin seem to glow in the lamplight. He looked younger somehow, less like a warrior and more like a man at peace in his own home. "Come," he said, offering her his arm with old-world courtesy. "Let me show you where you'll stay." The interior of the house took Catalina's breath away. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and handcrafted furniture that spoke of skill and patience. Navajo rugs covered the floors, their geometric patterns adding warmth and color to the space. But it was the books that surprised her most. Shelves lined with volumes in English, Spanish, and what she assumed was Comanche, proof of a mind that valued knowledge as much as skill. "You read?" she asked, running her fingers along the leather spines. My wife taught me English letters, Gray Wolf replied, his voice carrying the familiar note of sadness that always crept in when he spoke of Morning Star. And I learned Spanish from traders, the Comanche stories, those I remember from my grandfather. Books help me keep the languages sharp when I have no one to speak with. He led her down a hallway lined with photographs and artwork, some clearly the work of white artists, others bearing the distinctive style of Plains Indian craftsmanship. At the end of the hall, he opened a door to reveal a bedroom that made Catalina's heart clench with unexpected emotion. The room was clearly meant for a woman, decorated with a sensitivity that spoke of deep love and careful attention to detail. The bed was covered with a quilt of extraordinary beauty, its pattern telling the story of seasons changing and life renewing itself. Curtains of soft yellow cotton filtered the lamplight, and a dressing table held a silver mirror and brush set that gleamed with care. This was Morningstar's room, Gray Wolf said quietly, watching Catalina's face for signs of discomfort. I've kept it just as she left it, but I think she would want it to be used again. She never liked empty spaces, Catalina turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't, she whispered. This is sacred to you. It would be wrong to let it stay empty, Gray Wolf interrupted gently. Morningstar believed that rooms, like people, were meant to be filled with life. She would be angry with me if I let her space become a tomb. He moved to the dressing table and picked up a small wooden carving of a horse, its lines so graceful and lifelike that it seemed ready to gallop away. She made this, he said, placing it carefully in Catalina's hands. She carved animals when she was thinking, said it helped her understand their spirits. There are dozens of them throughout the house. Catalina held the carving carefully, feeling the smooth wood warm beneath her fingers. The skill evident in its creation spoke of hours of patient work, of an artist who saw beauty in the simplest subjects. She sounds wonderful, Catalina said softly. She was, Gray Wolf agreed. And she would have liked you. She had no patience for people who hurt others, but she always made room for those who were hurting themselves. After Gray Wolf had bid her good night and retired to his own room at the other end of the house, Catalina found herself alone in the most beautiful space she had ever occupied. The bed was softer than anything she had known, the sheets clean and sweet-smelling, the pillow perfectly sized for her head. But despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to burst through the door and drag her away from this impossible sanctuary. After months of constant vigilance, the absence of immediate threat felt almost as unsettling as danger itself. Her body remained tense, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble rising. From the bed, she moved to the window and looked out over the moonlit valley. The horses had settled for the night, dark shapes scattered across the silvery grass like peaceful dreams. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate, the sound lonely but not sad. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Catalina allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. What would it be like to live here, she wondered. To wake each morning to this view, to work alongside Gray Wolf, tending the horses and maintaining this beautiful sanctuary, to be part of something larger than her own desperate struggle to exist. The possibility seemed too wonderful to be real, too good to be anything more than a dream born of exhaustion and hope. She thought about Miguel and the life they had planned together, the house in California that would never be built, the children they would never have. For months, those lost dreams had been a source of crushing grief, but here in this peaceful room, surrounded by evidence of another woman's love and creativity, she found herself able to remember the joy as well as the sorrow. Maybe that was what healing looked like, she thought. Not forgetting the past, but making room for it to coexist with the present. Not replacing what was lost, but building something new from the pieces that remained. Dawn came gently to the hidden valley, painting the red rock walls in shades of rose and gold. that made the entire landscape seem to glow from within. Catalina woke to the sound of birds singing and the distant lowing of cattle. Sounds so peaceful and normal that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. The events of the previous days came rushing back, the cage, the rescue, the flight, through the darkness, and finally this impossible sanctuary, where she had been welcomed not as a burden, but as a guest. Rolling out of bed, she moved to the window and looked out on a scene that belonged more to paradise than to the harsh reality. A frontier Texas gray wolf was already up and working, moving among the horses with the easy confidence of someone born to the task. He spoke to each animal as he approached it, his voice too low for her to hear the words, but carrying a tone of gentle authority that the Paz-Dipe horses clearly understood and respected. Watching him work, Catalina began to understand that this man who had rescued her was far more complex than he had initially appeared. A soft knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Catalina?" Gray Wolf's voice called. "Breakfast is ready when you are." She dressed quickly in the same clothes she had worn for days, wincing at their condition but having no alternative. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Gray Wolf in the kitchen, a large and well-appointed space that occupied the back portion of the house. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and a table was set for two with pottery dishes and proper silverware. "I hope you slept well," he said, not looking up from the skillet where eggs were cooking to golden perfection. "Better than I have in months," Catalina admitted, taking the seat he indicated. "This place, it's like something from a dream." Gray Wolf placed a plate before her, loaded with more food than she had seen in weeks. The eggs were perfect, the bacon crisp, and the biscuits still warm from the oven. But even more than the quality of the food, it was the simple act of sitting at a proper table, eating from clean dishes, that brought tears to her eyes. "You're a wonderful cook," she said, taking a tentative bite of the eggs. "Morning Star taught me," Gray Wolf replied, settling into his own chair with a cup of coffee. She said a man who couldn't feed himself properly was only half civilized. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun streaming through the windows and filling the kitchen with warm light. Finally, Catalina found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her since the previous evening. "What do you want from me?" she said quietly. "You've shown me incredible kindness, but I know that nothing in this world is truly free. What do you expect in return?" Gray Wolf set down his coffee cup and studied her face for a long moment before answering. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not as a servant or a possession, but as a partner. This place is too much for one person to manage alone, and I've been letting it run down because I had no reason to maintain it properly." He gestured toward the window, where the valley spread out before them in all its untamed beauty. "There are 100 head of cattle out there, plus the horses. The garden needs constant attention, the buildings require maintenance, and there are a dozen other tasks that I've been neglecting because doing them alone felt pointless." Catalina listened carefully, trying to understand what he was really offering. "You want me to work for you," she said, not accusingly but seeking clarification. "I want you to work with me," Gray Wolf corrected. "This valley could support a dozen families if it were properly developed. There's enough water for irrigation, good grazing land, fertile soil in the bottomlands. We could build something here, not just a ranch, but a real community." The vision he painted was compelling, but Catalina had learned to be wary of dreams that seemed too good to be true. "And what happens when you decide you don't need me anymore?" she asked. "What happens when you meet someone you want to marry, someone who doesn't come with the baggage of being found in a cage?" Gray Wolf's expression grew serious. "I will never marry again," he said with quiet conviction. "Morning Star was my heart, and when she died, that part of me died with her. But I've learned that there are different kinds of love, different ways to care for someone. What I'm offering you is partnership, companionship, a place to belong. Nothing more, but nothing less either. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. And Catalina found herself believing him, despite her ingrained caution. Here was a man who understood loss, who had rebuilt his life from nothing, and was offering to share that reconstruction with her. "I don't know anything about ranching," she admitted. "I can cook and clean and mend clothes, but I've never worked with cattle or horses." "I'll teach you," Grey Wolf said simply, "just as you can teach me things I don't know. The division of labor doesn't have to follow traditional lines. We do what needs to be done, based on our abilities and interests." The radical nature of his proposal was not lost on Catalina. In a world where women were expected to be either wives or servants, he was offering her something unprecedented: true partnership, a voice in decisions, a share in the fruits of their combined labor. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why risk everything for a stranger you found in a cage?" Grey Wolf was quiet for so long that Catalina began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because," he said, "I know what it's like to be the only survivor of something terrible. I know what it's like to rebuild your life from nothing, to wake up each day and choose to keep going even when everything inside you wants to quit. I see that same strength in you, that same refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond your control." He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand, the contact warm and reassuring. "We're both damaged, Catalina. But maybe together, we can be something more than the sum of our individual wounds." As the morning wore on, Grey Wolf showed Catalina around the property, explaining his vision for its development and asking for her thoughts on various improvements. She found herself drawn into the planning process, despite her initial reservations, her mind automatically calculating the work required for each project and suggesting modifications that would make the tasks more efficient. They walked through the barn, where Grey Wolf kept his prize breeding horses, and she marveled at the quality of the animals and the obvious care with which they were maintained. In the workshop, she discovered evidence of Grey Wolf's skill as a craftsman, furniture in various stages of completion, tools maintained to perfection, and half-finished projects that spoke of a mind always working on improvements. "You made all this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a partially completed dining table. "Most of it," Grey Wolf confirmed. "Some pieces I learned to make from watching white carpenters. Others come from Comanche traditions. My grandfather taught me. Working with wood helps me think." The garden was overgrown but showed signs of having once been magnificent. Wild tomatoes sprawled across abandoned trellises. Herbs had escaped their designated beds to carpet the ground with fragrant green, and fruit trees heavy with unpicked produce created a Eden of plenty amidst the chaos. "This could feed 20 families," Catalina observed, already mentally organizing the space and planning the work needed to restore it to productivity. "Exactly," Grey Wolf said, pleased by her immediate understanding of the garden's potential. "Morning Star designed it, but I've let it go wild since she died. I kept telling myself I'd get back to it eventually, but eventually never came." As they stood in the overgrown garden, surrounded by the evidence of neglect and loss, Catalina felt something shift inside her chest. For months she had defined herself by what she had lost: her husband, her home, her place in the world. But here was an opportunity to define herself by what she could build, what she could nurture back to life. "I'll stay," she said suddenly, the words emerging before she had consciously made the decision. "I'll help you restore this place, make it what it was meant to be." Grey Wolf's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his entire face and making her realize how much sorrow he had been carrying. "Are you certain?" he asked. "It won't be easy work, and there will be challenges we can't anticipate." "I'm certain," Catalina said, and for the first time in months, she truly was. "I've been running from my past for too long. It's time to start building toward a future." As they shook hands to seal their agreement, standing in the wild garden beneath the vast Texas sky, Catalina felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. She was no longer Catalina Rodriguez, the homeless widow found in a cage. She was Catalina Rodriguez, partner in a venture that could transform not just this hidden valley, but the lives of everyone who found their way to its sanctuary. The work ahead would be difficult, the challenges numerous, but for the first time since Miguel's death, she was no longer facing the future alone. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing beside someone who understood that the greatest victories were often built from the ashes of the greatest defeats. 3 months had passed since Catalina's arrival at the Hidden Valley, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The wild garden had been tamed and expanded, its organized rows now yielding vegetables in quantities that seemed impossible for just 2 people to have accomplished. Pumpkins sprawled across carefully constructed hills, corn stalks stood tall and proud in perfectly straight lines, and tomato vines heavy with fruit created a red and green tapestry that stretched toward the creek. Catalina stood in the early morning mist, a wicker basket balanced on her hip as she harvested the day's produce. Her hands, once soft from her town life, were now calloused but strong, bearing the honest marks of productive labor. The simple brown dress she had worn during her imprisonment had been replaced by practical work clothes, split skirts for riding, sturdy boots that could handle any terrain, and cotton shirts that wouldn't tear on thorns or catch on fence posts. "The tomatoes are coming in faster than we can preserve them," she called to Gray Wolf, who was repairing a section of fence near the barn. "We'll need to decide whether to trade them in town or expand the root cellar." Gray Wolf looked up from his work, hammer suspended in mid-swing, and felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from watching Catalina in her element. She had taken to ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised them both, approaching each new challenge with the methodical intelligence of someone who had learned to adapt or perish. "What do you think?" he asked, walking over to examine the overflowing basket. "You know the preservation methods better than I do." It was typical of their partnership. Each deferred to the other's expertise without the petty power struggles that seemed to define most relationships between men and women on the frontier. Gray Wolf handled the livestock, construction, and trading, while Catalina had taken charge of the garden, food preservation, and the domestic systems that kept their small enterprise running smoothly. "I think we preserve what we need for winter and take the surplus to market," Catalina decided, setting the basket down and pushing a strand of dark hair away from her face. "But not to Dry Creek. There are other towns, other people who might appreciate good produce without asking too many questions about where it came from." The mention of Dry Creek brought a momentary shadow to both their faces. They had heard nothing from Sheriff Dalton or the townspeople since their escape, but the silence felt ominous rather than reassuring. Men like Dalton didn't forgive public humiliation, and they both knew that eventually the past would come looking for them. It was Catalina who spotted them first, 3 riders moving slowly along the valley rim, silhouetted against the afternoon sky-like figures from a nightmare. She had been hanging laundry on the line between 2 cottonwood trees when a flash of reflected sunlight caught her eye, and her blood turned to ice as she recognized the deliberate way they were studying the terrain below. "Gray Wolf," she called, her voice carefully controlled but urgent. "We have visitors." He emerged from the barn leading a young horse he had been training, his movements casual until he saw the direction of her gaze. Then his entire demeanor changed, the peaceful rancher disappearing as the Comanche warrior emerged. Without a word, he handed her the horse's lead rope and moved toward the house with the fluid grace of a predator. Sensing danger, the riders had found the hidden trail down into the valley and were descending slowly, their horses picking their way carefully along the switchbacked path. Even at a distance, there was something unmistakably official about their bearing, and Catalina felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. "Sheriff's posse," Gray Wolf said quietly, returning from the house with his rifle and a pair of field glasses. 3 men, well armed, and they're not here for a social visit. Through the glasses, he could make out details that chilled him. The lead rider was indeed wearing a badge, though it wasn't Sheriff Dalton from Dry Creek. This man was older, heavier, with the grim expression of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. The 2 men flanking him rode like professionals bounty hunters, most likely hired to do what local law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't do. "They've been tracking us," Catalina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time we thought we were safe, but they've been looking." Gray Wolf lowered the field glasses and studied her face, noting the fear but also the determination that had carried her through so much hardship. "Are you ready to run again?" he asked gently. "We can be packed and gone before they reach the valley floor." Catalina looked around at the life they had built together, the thriving garden, the well-maintained buildings, the horses grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. For 3 months, this had been more than a refuge. It had been home. The thought of abandoning it, of returning to the rootless existence of a fugitive, was almost unbearable. "No," she said finally, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm tired of running. This is our home, and I won't be driven from it again." The 3 riders reached the valley floor, just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Their arrival timed to coincide with the golden hour, when shadows grew long and visibility became tricky. It was a tactical decision that spoke of experience and planning, designed to give them every possible advantage in what they clearly expected to be a difficult encounter. Gray Wolf and Catalina waited on the veranda of the main house, presenting a united front that was both welcoming and wary. Gray Wolf held his rifle casually but visibly, while Catalina stood beside him with her hands empty, but her posture radiating the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The lead rider dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight as he approached. He was perhaps 50 years old, with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. "Afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but perfunctory. "I'm Marshal Wade Harrison, and these are my deputies. We're looking for a woman named Catalina Rodriguez. You found her," Catalina said simply, stepping forward before Gray Wolf could speak. "What do you want?" Marshal Harrison studied her carefully, taking note of her improved appearance, her confident bearing, and the obvious prosperity of her surroundings. Whatever he had been expecting to find, it clearly wasn't this, "Mrs. Rodriguez. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of vagrancy, theft, and destruction of public property," he said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "You're to be returned to Dry Creek for trial." Gray Wolf stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between Catalina and the marshal. "On whose authority?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "The territory of Texas and Sheriff Buck Dalton of Dry Creek," Harrison replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun as he registered the potential threat Gray Wolf represented. "The warrant is legal and binding." "Legal," Gray Wolf repeated, his tone suggesting that he found the concept amusing. "Was it legal to cage a woman for the crime of being poor? Was it legal to deny her food and water while she slowly died for the entertainment of your respectable citizens?" One of the deputies, a thin man with nervous eyes and a hair-trigger temper, shifted restlessly in his saddle. "That's not our concern," he said. "We're here to enforce the law, not debate it." "Whose law?" Catalina asked, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "The law that says a Mexican woman has no rights? The law that says poverty is a crime punishable by death? Or the law that says men like Sheriff Dalton can do whatever they want to people who can't fight back?" Marshal Harrison looked uncomfortable, and for the first time since arriving, his official composure began to crack. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said slowly, I've been told you stole food from local businesses and threatened the safety of the community. I've been told you were a vagrant, with no means of support who refused to move along when ordered to do so. You've been told lies, Grey Wolf said flatly. She took nothing. She threatened no one. Her only crime was being homeless and hungry in a town that had decided poverty was a moral failing. Can you prove that? Harrison asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to have doubts about the case he had been asked to prosecute. Grey Wolf and Catalina exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way that had developed between them over the months of working together. Then Catalina nodded slightly, giving him permission to reveal information they had both hoped would never be necessary. 3 months ago, I was in Dry Creek on business, Grey Wolf began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a carefully rehearsed story. I saw what happened to Mrs. Rodriguez. I saw how your Sheriff Dalton treated her, how the townspeople reacted to her suffering. I also saw the records he kept. He paused, allowing the implications of his words to sink in before continuing. Sheriff Dalton has been systematically targeting travelers, particularly those who can't fight back. He confiscates their possessions under the guise of protecting the community, then sells what he takes to line his own pockets. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't his first victim, and she wouldn't have been his last. Marshal Harrison's face had grown pale beneath his tan. Those are serious accusations, he said quietly. Do you have evidence? Grey Wolf reached into his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. A list, he said simply. Names, dates, amounts of money and goods confiscated. I took it from Dalton's desk while he was busy organizing his posse to chase us. 23 people over the past 2 years, mostly Mexicans and Indians, some women traveling alone. All of them accused of vagrancy or theft, all of them stripped of everything they owned. The document changed hands with the weight of destiny, and Marshal Harrison studied it with growing dismay. The evidence was damning, a meticulous record of systematic corruption that implicated not just Sheriff Dalton, but several prominent citizens of Dry Creek who had benefited from the illegal confiscations. This is ... Harrison began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to express his disgust. This is why I won't go back, Catalina said firmly. Not to face charges for crimes I didn't commit, not to be caged again for the convenience of men who profit from cruelty. I've built a life here, an honest life, and I won't let them destroy it. The nervous deputy was growing increasingly agitated. Marshal, he said urgently, our orders were clear. We're supposed to bring her back. No matter what stories she tells. Shut up, Collins, Harrison snapped, his attention still focused on the list in his hands. This changes everything. He looked up at Grey Wolf and Catalina, his expression troubled but thoughtful. Mrs. Rodriguez, I came here prepared to arrest a criminal. Instead, I find evidence of crimes far more serious than anything you've been accused of. This puts me in a difficult position. What kind of position? Grey Wolf asked, his hand still resting casually on his rifle. Harrison folded the document carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. The kind where I have to decide between following orders and doing what's right. The kind where I have to choose between maintaining the status quo and pursuing actual justice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily overhead, and the evening breeze rustled through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like whispered prayers. Finally, Marshal Harrison made his decision. Mrs. Rodriguez, he said formally, in light of new evidence that has come to my attention, I'm suspending the warrant for your arrest, pending a full investigation into the activities of Sheriff Dalton and his associates. The nervous deputy exploded. Marshal, you can't do that. Our orders, Harrison interrupted coldly, are to serve justice, not to enable corruption. Deputy Collins, you and Deputy Martinez We'll return to Austin immediately and inform the territorial governor that we have uncovered evidence of systematic criminal activity in Dry Creek. I'll be conducting a thorough investigation before any arrests are made." As the two deputies rode away, clearly unhappy with their dismissal, but unwilling to challenge their superior directly, Marshal Harrison dismounted and accepted Gray Wolf's invitation to share their evening meal. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Catalina had expected when she first saw the riders approaching their valley. "I've been a lawman for 23 years, Harrison said as they sat around the kitchen table sharing Catalina's expertly prepared stew. "I've seen enough corruption to know it when I smell it, but I've also seen enough good people caught in bad situations to know the difference between actual criminals and victims of circumstance." He gestured toward the comfortable, well-maintained house around them. "This isn't the hideout of desperate fugitives. This is the home of people who are building something meaningful with their lives. What happens now?" Catalina asked, still not quite able to believe that the threat she had been dreading for months had been neutralized so easily. "Now I go back to Dry Creek and conduct a proper investigation," Harrison replied. "I'll examine Sheriff Dalton's records, interview the victims whose names are on that list, and build a case that will put him and his accomplices where they belong. It might take months, but when I'm finished, you'll be able to travel anywhere in Texas without fear of arrest." Gray Wolf leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you continue building your life here," Harrison said simply. "You've created something good in this valley, something that benefits not just yourselves, but potentially anyone who might need refuge from the kind of corruption you escaped. Don't let the fear of what might happen stop you from pursuing what should happen." After Marshal Harrison had departed the next morning, riding south toward the confrontation that would eventually destroy Sheriff Dalton's criminal enterprise, Gray Wolf and Catalina found themselves alone with possibilities they had barely dared to imagine. The threat that had hung over them for months was finally lifting, and for the first time since their partnership began, they could plan for a future that extended beyond mere survival. "He was right about one thing," Catalina said as they walked through the garden together, harvesting vegetables for their morning meal. "We have created something good here. Something that could help other people who find themselves in situations like mine." Gray Wolf nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of what she was suggesting. "A refuge," he said slowly. "A place where people who have nowhere else to go can find safety and purpose." "More than that," Catalina said, her voice growing excited as the vision took shape. "A place where they can learn skills, rebuild their lives, become part of something larger than their individual struggles. We could teach them ranching, farming, crafts, whatever they need to become self-sufficient." The idea was revolutionary in its scope and ambition, but as they discussed the details, it began to seem not just possible but inevitable. They had the land, the resources, and most importantly, the understanding of what it meant to rebuild from nothing. Who better to help others through that process than people who had walked that path themselves? "We'll need more buildings," Gray Wolf mused, already mentally designing the structures that would be required. "Dormitories, workshops, expanded storage for food and supplies. And we'll need to establish connections with towns where people can find permanent employment. Once they're ready to move on. We'll need teachers too," Catalina added. "People who can provide education, not just job training. If we're going to help people build new lives, we need to give them all the tools they'll need to succeed." As they talked, their shared vision became more detailed and more ambitious. This hidden valley, which had begun as a refuge for two damaged souls, could become a beacon of hope for anyone who had lost their way in an often cruel and unforgiving world. The work ahead would be enormous, the challenges significant, but for the first time in years, both Gray Wolf and Catalina felt the stirring of something that had been dormant for too long. Hope for a future that extended beyond their own survival. Hope for a legacy that would outlast their individual lives, standing together in the garden they had restored, surrounded by the evidence of what two people could accomplish when they combined their strengths and supported each other's dreams. They began to plan for a tomorrow that would be worthy of all they had endured to reach this moment. The sun climbed higher over their hidden valley, painting everything in shades of gold and promise, and the future spread out before them like an unwritten book waiting to be filled with stories of redemption, growth, and the endless human capacity for renewal. 6 months had passed since Marshal Harrison's visit, and the hidden valley had transformed into something that neither Grey Wolf nor Catalina could have imagined when they first shook hands over their partnership agreement. What had begun as a simple ranch was evolving into a thriving community, a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. The first refugees had arrived in late autumn, a family of former slaves from Louisiana, whose freedom had brought them nothing but starvation and persecution, and an elderly German immigrant whose sons had died in a mining accident, leaving him destitute and alone. Word of the valley's sanctuary had spread through the underground networks that connected the dispossessed, carried by travelers and traders who understood that some knowledge was too valuable to share carelessly. Now, in the crisp air of a Texas winter morning, smoke rose from 7 different chimneys scattered throughout the valley. The main house had been expanded with 2 additional wings, and 4 smaller cabins dotted the landscape like seeds of hope planted in fertile ground. The workshop buzzed with activity as refugees learned carpentry, leatherworking, and metallsmithing under Grey Wolf's patient instruction, while Catalina's expanded garden had become a classroom for sustainable agriculture. "Maria, remember to check the root cellars again," Catalina called to a young Mexican woman who was carrying buckets of feed to the chickens. "The temperature needs to stay constant if we want the preserved vegetables to last through spring." Maria Santos had arrived 3 weeks earlier, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man who had already beaten 2 previous wives to death. She was 17 years old, spoke little English, and flinched whenever men raised their voices, but she had thrown herself into learning with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only thing that could guarantee her freedom. "Si, Signora Catalina," Maria replied, her smile shy but genuine. "I checked this morning, and the turnips are storing well. But I think the carrots need more sand around them." It was conversations like these that filled Catalina with a satisfaction deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Each small success, each moment of confidence slowly building in someone who had arrived broken and afraid, felt like a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy her own spirit. Grey Wolf emerged from the workshop where he had been teaching young Samuel Washington, the 19-year-old son of the Louisiana family, how to shoe horses. Samuel had arrived unable to read or write, his hands soft from plantation life that had never allowed him to develop practical skills. Now, after months of patient instruction, he could not only handle basic smithy work, but had also learned to read well enough to study agricultural texts. "Samuel's ready to take on the Mare's shoes by himself," Grey Wolf announced as he approached Catalina near the chicken coop. "His technique is solid, and he's starting to understand how to read a horse's gait to identify problems before they become serious." The pride in Grey Wolf's voice was unmistakable. Teaching had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Morning Star's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival, a connection to the future through the lives he was helping to shape. It was Joshua, the elderly German immigrant who served as the valley's unofficial postmaster during his weekly trips to the nearest town, who brought the news that would shatter their peaceful routine. He returned from his supply run with a grim expression and a letter that bore an official seal, its very presence radiating the kind of authority that had learned to fear. "This came for you," he said, handing the envelope to Grey Wolf with obvious reluctance. The postmaster in Cedar Falls said a federal marshal left it specifically for Matthew Wolf, with instructions that it was to be delivered regardless of how long it took to find you. Gray Wolf accepted the letter with steady hands, but Catalina could see the tension that immediately filled his shoulders. Official correspondence never brought good news to people like them, and the federal seal suggested problems that went far beyond local corruption. He tore open the envelope and read, silently, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he handed the letter to Catalina without a word, his jaw set in the rigid lines that she had learned to associate with barely controlled anger. The letter was from Marshal Harrison, but the tone was completely different from the friendly correspondence they had received over the past months, updating them on his investigation into Sheriff Dalton's activities. This was formal, urgent, and deeply troubling. Mr. Wolf and Mrs. Rodriguez. The letter began, I am writing to warn you that your situation has become extremely dangerous. My investigation into Sheriff Dalton's criminal activities has been too successful. 3 weeks ago, I arrested Dalton and 4 of his associates on federal charges of corruption, theft, and civil rights violations. The evidence was overwhelming, and I expected quick convictions. Catalina felt her stomach drop as she continued reading. However, Dalton's connections run deeper than I realized. His brother-in-law, Judge Marcus Cromwell, has significant influence in the territorial government. Rather than allowing federal prosecution to proceed, Judge Cromwell has used his political connections to have the case transferred to state jurisdiction, where he controls the outcome. The implications were staggering. Instead of facing justice, Sheriff Dalton was being protected by a corrupt system that valued political connections over rule of law. But the letter's next paragraph contained news that was even worse, more troubling. Dalton has convinced Judge Cromwell that you, Mr. Wolf, are a dangerous renegade Indian who has been harboring criminals and stolen goods on your property. A new warrant has been issued charging you with kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and theft of government property. Mrs. Rodriguez is now classified as stolen property, since Dalton maintains that she was lawfully imprisoned and illegally removed from custody. Gray Wolf's hands clenched into fists as he finished reading the letter's final paragraphs. Marshal Harrison had risked his own career to send this warning, revealing that a federal posse led by Deputy Marshal James Crawford was already en route to the valley with orders to arrest Gray Wolf and return Catalina to Dalton's custody. Posse was expected to arrive within days, and unlike Harrison's small group, this would be a military-style operation with enough men and firepower to overcome any resistance. Stolen property, Catalina said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They're calling me stolen property. The other residents of the valley had gathered around as news of the letter spread, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and anger that Gray Wolf and Catalina were experiencing. These people had found hope in the sanctuary, had begun to believe that they could build new lives free from the persecution that had driven them from their homes. Now that hope was being threatened by the same corrupt forces they had fled. What do we do? Asked Samuel Washington, his young face set in determined lines that made him look older than his 19 years. Do we run? Do we fight? Do we scatter and hope they can't track all of us? It was a question that cut to the heart of everything they had built together. The valley represented more than just a refuge. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people who had been broken by injustice came together to support each other. Abandoning it would mean surrendering not just their physical sanctuary, but the hope that had sustained them through the darkest moments of their rebuilding. Gray Wolf looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had arrived as refugees, but had become family, individuals who had found not just shelter, but purpose in their shared mission of creating something better from the ashes of their losses. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who had trusted him enough to make this valley their home. We don't run, he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority. That had made him a natural leader. We don't scatter. And we don't surrender what we've built to men who profit from cruelty. Then we fight? Maria asked, her young voice trembling but determined. We fight, Grey Wolf confirmed. But not the way they expect. Not as desperate fugitives making a last stand, but as a community defending its right to exist. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intense preparation, as the residents of the valley transformed their peaceful sanctuary into a fortress capable of withstanding a military assault. Grey Wolf's knowledge of Comanche warfare tactics, combined with the practical skills their community had developed, created a defensive strategy that was both sophisticated and ruthless. The valley's natural geography provided significant advantages. There was only one practical entrance for mounted men, and the surrounding cliffs offered excellent positions for defenders with rifles. But Grey Wolf understood that their greatest strength lay not in the terrain, but in the motivation of the people defending it. They're coming to destroy everything we've built, he explained to the assembled community as they gathered in the main house on the evening before the expected assault. They want to drag Catalina back to a cage, scatter the rest of you to the winds, and turn this place back into empty land that serves no one. He paused, looking around at faces that reflected determination rather than fear. But we're not. The same people who arrived here broken and alone. We've become something stronger, something worth defending. Tomorrow, we show them what happens when people who have nothing left to lose decide to stand together. The defensive preparations were meticulous and comprehensive. Samuel and 2 other men had spent the day positioning large stones and fallen logs to create barriers that would force attackers to move through carefully controlled killing zones. The women had prepared medical supplies, ammunition, and emergency food stores that could sustain the community through an extended siege. Most importantly, Grey Wolf had sent messages to allies throughout the region, Comanche bands who still remembered him, Mexican families who had benefited from the valley's assistance, and even some white ranchers who had come to respect what the community was building. Help might not arrive in time for the initial assault, but the posse would find that attacking the valley meant confronting far more than just its immediate residents. As darkness fell over the valley, an unusual calm settled over the community. The frantic preparations had been completed. The defensive positions were manned, and all that remained was the waiting. It was during these quiet hours that the true nature of what they had built together became most apparent. In the main house, Maria sat with Mrs. Washington, the mother of the Louisiana family, carefully loading rifle cartridges while sharing stories of their respective homelands. The older woman's steady hands guided the teenager's nervous fingers, passing on skills that might mean the difference between life and death. In the morning, near the barn, Samuel worked alongside Joshua, the elderly German immigrant, cleaning and checking rifles with the methodical precision that Grey Wolf had taught them. Despite the 40-year age difference between them, they had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared determination to protect the community that had given them both new purpose. Grey Wolf and Catalina walked the defensive perimeter together, checking positions and offering quiet words of encouragement to the volunteers, who would spend the night watching for the first signs of the approaching posse. The conversation between them was sparse but meaningful, filled with the understanding that came from shared hardship and mutual trust. "Are you afraid?" Catalina asked as they paused at the overlook that provided the best view of the valley's entrance. "Yes," Grey Wolf admitted without shame. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting them destroy what we've built, of watching them drag you back to that cage, of seeing our people scattered like leaves in a storm." Catalina reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that had become natural over the months of their partnership. "We won't fail," she said with quiet conviction. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we've already succeeded in the most important way. We've proven that people can choose to help each other instead of hurting each other. We've shown that home isn't a place you're born to, but something you build with the people who matter to you." Dawn came cold and clear, painting the valley walls in shades of rose and gold, seemed almost mockingly beautiful given the violence that was approaching. Gray Wolf had been awake since before sunrise, making final adjustments to their defensive positions and ensuring that everyone understood their roles in the coming battle. It was Maria who spotted them first, a dust cloud rising from the desert. Beyond the valley's entrance, moving with the steady purposefulness of mounted men who knew exactly where they were going. She called out softly from her position among the rocks, her young voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "They're coming." Maybe 20 riders, moving in formation. Gray Wolf raised his field glasses and studied the approaching force, noting details that confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't a simple arrest party, but a military expedition, complete with extra horses, supply wagons, and enough firepower to level a small town. Deputy Marshal Crawford had clearly decided to overwhelm any possible resistance through sheer force. "Remember," Gray Wolf called out to his defenders, "we're not trying to kill them all. We're trying to make them understand that taking this valley will cost more than they're willing to pay. Make every shot count, stay in cover, and don't expose yourselves for heroics." The posse reached the valley floor just as the sun cleared the eastern rim, their presence immediately transforming the peaceful sanctuary into a battlefield. Deputy Marshal Crawford rode at their head, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. His eyes swept across the valley, taking note of the defensive preparations and the obvious prosperity of the community they had come to destroy. "Matthew Wolf," Crawford called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "By order of the Territory of Texas, you are under arrest for kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and theft of government property. Surrender yourself and the woman, and no one else needs to be hurt." Gray Wolf stepped into view on the veranda of the main house, his rifle held casually but ready. "Deputy Marshal Crawford," he replied, his voice equally calm and carrying. "You're trespassing on private property. You have no authority here, and your warrant is based on lies told by corrupt men. Turn around and ride away, and no one needs to die today." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. 20 armed lawmen facing a community of refugees who had decided that death was preferable to surrender. The morning breeze rustled through the cottonwood leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called to its mate, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Then Crawford raised his hand, and the battle for the soul of the hidden valley began. Deputy Marshal Crawford's hand fell like a hammer, and the valley erupted into chaos. The first volley from the posse's rifles shattered the morning stillness, bullets whining off rocks and splintering wood as the defenders dove for cover. But Gray Wolf's careful planning immediately showed its value. The attackers found themselves firing at shadows and prepared positions, while exposing themselves to devastating return fire from concealed riflemen scattered throughout the valley. Samuel Washington, positioned behind a carefully constructed stone barrier near the creek, squeezed off his first shot and watched with grim satisfaction as one of Crawford's men tumbled from his horse. The young man who had arrived at the valley, unable to read, had become a marksman whose steady hands and calm nerves made him deadly at long range. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Maria called from her position among the rocks near the garden. Her voice was steady despite her youth, and her rifle spoke with the authority of someone who had learned to shoot not for sport, but for survival. The deputy, who had been attempting to work around their defensive line, jerked backward and slumped in his saddle. The battle quickly settled into a deadly pattern of advance and retreat as Crawford's men discovered that every approach to the main buildings was covered by interlocking fields of fire. The valley's defenders had turned their sanctuary into a maze of death traps, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. But the posse had advantages too superior: numbers, military training, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged siege. Crawford himself had taken position behind a fallen log near the valley entrance, his field glasses sweeping back and forth as he analyzed the defensive positions and planned his next move. "They're better organized than I expected," he muttered. To his sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Murphy who had fought in the Civil War and understood the realities of combat. "This isn't some desperate last stand. They've prepared for this." Murphy nodded grimly, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "The Indian knows what he's doing. This is going to cost us, Marshal. Maybe more than the territory is willing to pay." As the morning wore on, the true price of the battle became apparent. 3 of Crawford's men lay dead, and 5 more had been wounded seriously enough to require medical attention. But the valley's defenders had paid their own toll. Joshua, the elderly German immigrant, had taken a bullet through the lung while helping to resupply ammunition to the forward positions. He lay in the main house now, tended by Mrs. Washington. His breathing labored, but his spirit unbroken. "I did not come to America to die in a cage," he whispered to Catalina as she knelt beside his makeshift bed. "If I must die, let it be defending something worth defending." The old man's courage was typical of the spirit that animated the valley's defense. These were people who had already lost everything once and had no intention of allowing it to happen again. They fought not just for their physical sanctuary, but for the idea that people could choose to help each other instead of preying on the weak. Gray Wolf moved constantly throughout the battle zone, appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest. His presence alone worth several additional rifles. He fought with the fluid grace of a Comanche warrior, but also with the tactical intelligence of someone who understood that this battle was about more than just survival. It was about proving a principle. "Fall back to the secondary positions," he called to Samuel and 2 other defenders who were being pressed hard by a coordinated assault on the eastern flank. "Make them pay for every yard, but don't get trapped." The withdrawal was executed with military precision, each defender covering the others as they moved to new positions that had been prepared in advance. Crawford's men found themselves advancing into empty ground, while new rifle fire erupted from unexpected directions. It was noon when the battle's momentum began to shift decisively. Crawford had committed most of his remaining effective men to a frontal assault on the main house, believing that overwhelming firepower could crack the defenders' resolve. But as his men charged across the open ground near the garden, they ran into a killing zone that Gray Wolf had prepared specifically for such an attack. Rifle fire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, catching the attackers in a crossfire that decimated their ranks. 6 men fell in as many seconds, and the survivors found themselves pinned down in the open with no cover and no way to retreat. The charge that was supposed to end the battle had become a disaster that might well end Crawford's career. "Pull back," Crawford shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fall back to the creek." But as his men attempted to withdraw, they discovered that their retreat was being harassed by rifle fire from positions they hadn't even known existed. Gray Wolf had prepared multiple fallback lines, each one designed to inflict maximum casualties on attackers while providing his own people with safe routes to the next defensive position. The posse's withdrawal became a rout as demoralized. Men fled toward the valley entrance, leaving their wounded behind and abandoning equipment in their haste to escape the deadly accuracy of the defenders' rifles. Crawford himself barely made it to safety, a bullet from Maria's rifle creasing his shoulder and ruining his uniform jacket, as Crawford rallied his remaining men near the valley entrance, desperately trying to restore some semblance of military order. A new element entered the battle that changed everything. Dust clouds appeared on 3 different horizons, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon walls as mounted groups converged on the valley from multiple directions. Gray Wolf's messages had reached their intended recipients. The first group to arrive was a band of young Comanche warriors led by Swift Eagle, Gray Wolf's cousin, who had ridden hard for 2 days to reach the battle in time. Behind them came a mixed group of Mexican vaqueros and their families, People who had benefited from the valley's assistance and who understood that allowing this sanctuary to be destroyed would endanger them all, but it was the third group that truly transformed the situation. Marshal Harrison himself rode at the head of a federal posse, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun and his face set in the grim lines of a man who had come to settle accounts. Behind him rode 12 deputies, all federal marshals with authority. That superseded Crawford's territorial warrant. "Deputy Marshal Crawford," Harrison called out as he approached the battered remnants of the territorial posse. "By order of the federal court, I'm placing you under arrest for exceeding your authority and conducting an illegal military action against civilians." Crawford's face went white with shock and rage. "What are you talking about?" he sputtered. "I have a legal warrant. You have a fraudulent document issued by corrupt officials," Harrison replied coldly. "The federal investigation into Sheriff Dalton's activities has been completed, and Judge Cromwell has been arrested for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The charges against Matthew Wolf and Catalina Rodriguez have been dismissed, and this valley has been officially recognized as a legitimate settlement." The news hit Crawford like a physical blow. His entire justification for the assault had evaporated, leaving him exposed as the aggressor in an unprovoked attack on innocent civilians. Around him, his surviving men began laying down their weapons, understanding that continuing to fight would transform them from lawmen into outlaws. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, the true scope of what had been accomplished began to emerge. The battle had lasted less than 6 hours, but its implications would resonate throughout Texas territory for years to come. A community of refugees had successfully defended themselves against a military assault, proving that ordinary people could stand up to corruption when they had something worth defending. The casualties were sobering but not devastating. The valley had lost Joshua, whose lung wound proved too severe for the limited medical resources available, and 2 other defenders had been seriously wounded. But all would survive, and their sacrifice had purchased something precious: the right to exist, to build, to help others in need. Crawford's posse had suffered far worse: 7 dead, 11 wounded, and their reputation in ruins. More importantly, the federal investigation that followed would expose the entire network of corruption that had enabled Sheriff Dalton's crimes, leading to indictments that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Marshal Harrison said as the community gathered in the main house that evening to tend their wounded and count their blessings, "I owe you an apology. When I first came here months ago, I thought I was investigating a simple case of vagrancy and theft. Instead, I discovered a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years, victimizing dozens of innocent people." Catalina looked around at the faces surrounding her. People who had become family, who had been willing to die rather than see her dragged back to a cage. "No apology is necessary, Marshal," she said quietly. "You did what was right when you learned the truth. That's all any of us can do." In the weeks that followed the battle, the Hidden Valley experienced a transformation that exceeded even Gray Wolf and Catalina's most optimistic visions. News of their successful defense spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who understood that something significant had happened in that remote canyon among the red rocks. Refugees began arriving in greater numbers, not just the desperate and dispossessed, but skilled craftsmen and professionals who were drawn by the community's reputation for fairness and opportunity. A blacksmith from Oklahoma Territory brought his entire family after hearing that the valley welcomed people based on their willingness to work rather than their racial background. A teacher from Kansas arrived with a wagon full of books, eager to establish a school that would serve not just the valley's children but anyone in the region who wanted to learn. The federal government, embarrassed by the corruption scandal and eager to demonstrate support for legitimate settlements, provided official recognition and protection for the valley. A post office was established, along with a territorial judge who held court monthly to resolve disputes and record legal transactions. But perhaps the most significant change was in Catalina and Gray Wolf themselves. The woman who had been found dying in a cage for the crime of being poor had become a community leader whose opinion was sought on everything from crop rotation to conflict resolution. The Comanche warrior who had lost his family and his world had found a new purpose in creating a place where such losses could be healed. Do you ever miss it? Catalina asked one evening as they walked through the expanded garden, now large enough to feed 50 families and still produce surplus for trade. The simple life we had before all this? When it was just the two of us working together. Gray Wolf considered the question carefully, watching the lights in the windows of the dozen cabins that now dotted the valley floor. I miss the quiet, he admitted. But I don't miss the loneliness. What we built together was beautiful. But what we've built with others is necessary. 5 years after Catalina's rescue from the cage in Dry Creek, the Hidden Valley had become a legend throughout the Southwest. It was spoken of in the same breath as other great experiments in American democracy, a place where the promise of equality and opportunity was actually kept, where people were judged by their character and contributions rather than their race or background. The original community of refugees had evolved into a thriving town of nearly 200 residents. The workshops produced goods that were prized throughout Texas territory. The school had become a model for progressive education, and the agricultural techniques developed in the valley were being copied by farmers across the region. But success had not corrupted the community's founding principles. New arrivals were still evaluated based on their willingness to contribute rather than their ability to pay, and the town council that governed the valley included representatives from every ethnic group and social background. Decisions were made by consensus whenever possible, and disputes were resolved through mediation rather than force. Catalina and Gray Wolf had married in the 3rd year after the battle. A simple ceremony conducted in the valley's new church and attended by the entire community. They had no children of their own, but they had become surrogate parents to dozens of young people who had arrived alone and afraid and had grown into confident, capable adults. Sometimes I think about that day in Dry Creek, Catalina said, as they stood together on the veranda of their expanded house, watching the sunset paint the valley walls in shades of gold and crimson. I think about the woman I was then, so broken, so certain that her life was over. What do you think she would say if she could see this? Gray Wolf asked, gesturing toward the bustling community spread out before them. Catalina smiled, her face reflecting the deep contentment that came from a life lived in service to something larger than oneself. I think she would say that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that ever could happen. As night fell over the valley and the lights in the windows began to twinkle like earthbound stars, the story that had begun with a woman locked in a cage reached its true conclusion. Not with the dramatic rescue or the climactic battle, but with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and lives well lived. The cage in Dry Creek had long since been torn down, its iron bars melted down and forged into tools that helped build houses and schools. Sheriff Dalton had died in federal prison, his corruption exposed and his victims vindicated. Judge Cromwell had been stripped of his position and his property, his network of criminal associates scattered to the winds, but the real victory was not the punishment of the guilty, but the triumph of the innocent. In a world that often seemed designed to crush the weak and reward the cruel, one Hidden Valley had proved that another way was possible. People could choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Communities could be built on compassion instead of competition. Hope could survive even the darkest circumstances if it was nurtured by those who understood its value. The woman who had been imprisoned for being poor had become the mother of a movement that would inspire similar communities throughout the American West. The Comanche warrior who had lost everything had found a way to transform his grief into grace, his isolation into connection, his personal tragedy into collective triumph, and in the end, that transformation was the most important victory of all. Not the defeat of specific enemies or the accumulation of material wealth, but the proof that human beings could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded, could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their broken dreams. The Hidden Valley slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, its residents secure in the knowledge that they had created something worth defending, something that would endure long after their individual stories had ended. They had taken the worst that life could offer and alchemized it into gold, proving that sometimes the most unlikely people in the most desperate circumstances can accomplish the most extraordinary things. In the morning, there would be new challenges to face, new refugees to welcome, new problems to solve. But tonight, all was well in the sanctuary they had built together, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten book filled with infinite possibility.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.